Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Storytime. My name's Charlie Malone, and every week I like to share a story that's special to me and that I hope you will enjoy. And this week's story is The White Snake, one of the many stories collected by the Brothers Grimm. The White Snake is not one of their most well-known stories, and so when I read it to children, they're very curious about it because there's just something new to them. And it's quite an odd story. I hope you enjoy it. There once lived a king who was renowned far and wide for his wisdom. Nothing could be kept hidden from him, and it seemed almost as if the winds must be carrying news to him about the most secret matters. He had one very strange custom. Every day at noon, when the table had been cleared and all the guests had left, a trusted servant would bring him one additional dish. It always had a cover on it, and the servant himself had no idea what was inside. No one knew, because the king always waited until he was all alone to lift the lid and eat from the dish. This practice went on for some time until one day the servant, whose job it was to take the dish away, was overcome by curiosity so powerful that he could not resist it. He brought the dish into his own room. After making sure that the door was locked, he lifted the lid and discovered a white snake. One look at it and he was unable to resist the desire to have a taste. He cut off a small piece and put it in his mouth. As soon as his tongue touched it, he could hear the strange whispers of sweet voices outside his window. He went over to listen and discovered that some sparrows were talking to each other and sharing what they had seen in the fields and in the forest. Tasting the snake had given him the power to understand the language of animals. On that very same day, the queen happened to lose her most precious ring. Suspicion fell on the trusted servant for the loss of the ring, for he was free to go wherever he wanted. The king ordered him to appear before him and used harsh words to threaten him, warning that if he did not name the thief by morning, then he would be declared guilty and beheaded. The servant protested his innocence, but it did no good. The king could think of nothing else and dismissed him without further ado. Agitated and worried, he went over to the courtyard and tried to find a way out of the trouble he was in. Some ducks were sitting quietly by the edge of a babbling brook, preening themselves with their beaks and having a private chat. The servant stopped in his tracks and listened. They were talking about where they had been waddling about all morning, as well as about the tasty things they had found. One of them said with a prickly voice, "Well, there's something heavy lying in my stomach. I must have eaten too fast and swallowed a ring that was lying on the ground under the queen's window." The servant quickly grabbed the bird by the neck, carried her straight to the kitchen, and said to the cook, "Here's a well-fed duck. Now it's time to slaughter it." "I think you're right," the cook replied as he lifted the duck up in the air. "This one has been busy stuffing itself, and it's high time to roast it." So he killed the duck, and while he was cleaning it out, he discovered something in its stomach that turned out to be the queen's ring. At last the servant was able to prove his innocence to the king, who was eager to make amends for having wronged him. He offered to grant the servant a royal favor and told him he could have any post, any job he wanted at court. The servant declined everything offered. Instead, he requested a horse and some money for a journey, since he was eager to see the world and to travel for a while. The wish was granted, and he went on his way. One day, while passing a pond, he noticed that 3 fish were trapped in the reeds and gasping for lack of water. They were kind of sort of backed away in a corner so they couldn't get back into the pond. Even though people say that fish are mute and can't talk, he could hear their distress about the miserable death they were facing. As a man with a kind heart, he got off his horse and put the 3 captives back into the pond. Wriggling for joy, they poked their heads out of the water and chanted, "We shall remember this and one day repay you for saving our lives." The servant traveled on, and after a while he thought he could hear a voice in the sand at his feet. He listened carefully and heard an ant king complaining. "Oh, if only people would steer their clumsy beasts away from us! That horse has no feelings at all and is trampling my people to death with its big heavy hooves." So the servant turned onto a side road, and the ant king, noticing what he had done, called out, "We shall remember this and one day repay you." The servant's path led him through a forest, and there he ran into a father raven and a mother raven next to their nest, tossing the chicks out of the nest. "Off with you, freeloaders!" they cried. "We can't fill your bellies any longer. You're grown up now and can feed yourselves." The poor chicks flapped their wings and struggled to lift themselves up from the ground. "But we're only helpless children. How in the world can we feed ourselves when we can't fly? We'll end up starving to death." When he heard that, the kind young man dismounted. He found somebody he could trade his horse with for some food, and he gave the food to the young ravens as food. They hopped over, ate their fill, and cried out, "We shall remember this and one day repay you." From then on, he had to rely on his own legs, and after walking for a long stretch, he reached a big city. Noise filled the streets, and a man rode through the crowds on horseback to announce that the princess was looking for somebody to marry. However, anyone wishing to win her hand would have to carry out an extremely difficult task, and if he failed, he would be executed. Many young men had already attempted the task, but in vain, and they had lost their lives. When the young man set eyes on the king's daughter and listened to her speak, he was so dazzled by her great beauty and intelligence that he paid no attention to the risk, went to see the king, and presented himself as a suitor. The young man was taken straight out to sea, and right before his eyes, a golden ring was tossed into the ocean. The king then ordered him to retrieve the ring from the bottom of the ocean, and he added, "If you come up without it, you will be pushed back in, again and again, until finally you'll drown in the waves." Everyone who was watching felt pity for the handsome young man, but soon he was left all alone on the shores. As he stood there wondering what to do and what he could possibly do to get the ring, suddenly he caught sight of 3 fish swimming toward him, and they were none other than the fish whose lives he had saved. The one in the middle had a shell in its mouth, and he put it down on the shore at the feet of the young man, who picked it up and found the golden ring inside. Overjoyed, the young man took the ring to the king, expecting him to bestow the promised reward and let him speak to the princess. But when the proud princess discovered that he was not her equal in birth, that means that he was a servant and she was a fancy princess, she demanded that he perform a second task. She went to the garden and strewed millet from 10 sacks in the grass. That's like seed, like all over in the grass. And she said, "Before the sun comes up tomorrow, you must pick them all out," she declared, "and not a single grain should be missing." The boy sat down in the garden and searched his mind for a way of completing the task. But nothing occurred to him, and he just sat there mournfully, picking up a few of the millet seeds, waiting for the break of day, when he would surely be taken to his death. But when the sun's rays hit the garden, he found all 10 sacks standing in a row, filled to the brim, and not even the tiniest bit of grain was missing. Maybe you've already guessed what had happened. The Ant King had appeared in the middle of the night with thousands upon thousands of ants, and the grateful animals had worked hard to gather the millet 1 grain at a time to fill all 10 sacks. The princess herself walked over to the garden and was astonished to see that the task had been completed. But she could not tame her proud heart, and instead said, "Even if he has completed the 2 tasks, he will not be my husband until he has brought me an apple from the tree of life." Now, the boy had no idea where he might find the tree of life, or even what the tree of life was, but he started off anyway and decided to keep walking as far as his legs would carry him, even though He really had no hope of finding it. He traveled across 3 kingdoms and reached a forest in the evening. Then he sat down under a tree to get some sleep. Suddenly he heard a noise in the branches, and a golden apple fell right into his hand. Just then 3 ravens flew down to him, perched on his knee, and said, "We are the 3 ravens you rescued from starvation. We grew up, and then we learned that you were seeking the golden apple. So we flew across the ocean to the end of the world where the tree of life grows, and we picked the apple for you. Thank you again for saving our lives." Full of joy, the young man set off for home and brought the beautiful princess the golden apple. Now she had run out of excuses. They divided up the apple of life and shared it. Then her heart overflowed with love for him, and his heart overflowed with love for her, and they lived to a ripe old age in peace and happiness. And that is the story of the white snake and the curious servant. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week with another story. Until then, see you outside.